April 2014. It's 1 year after the Boston Marathon bombing, and there are crowds back on Boylston Street, the finish line freshly repainted, the runners are back, and the cameras are showing the resilience of the community and the runners. Leaders talk about strength and recovery, and the city re-declares itself Boston strong. And then the race runs, someone wins, people have personal bests, and the story moves on. For many people, though, the body didn't move on. Some survivors, even a year later, struggling to sleep, avoiding Boylston Street or crowded places, struggling to concentrate. Some have returned to work, many have returned to work, to school, to daily life, outwardly functional, but still struggling inside. And that gap between the public face of the story and the private reality of survivors is what we're talking about today. Hi, welcome to Notes on Resilience. I'm your host, Manya Chilinsky. Today's episode is about what happens when our communities and institutions move forward, but some individuals don't. We see this after all sorts of crises: terrorist attacks, wildfires, hurricanes, school shootings, mass layoffs. The public resets, media moves on, maybe leaders mark milestone. That's what's supposed to be happening. But at that same time, recovery inside a human nervous system doesn't follow that schedule. We don't follow the press. We don't follow what our organizations say we're supposed to do. So let me slow that down a little bit. We know that our institutions, our organizations, workplace, communities, we operate on timelines. We have fiscal years, there are election cycles, budgets, academic semesters, quarterly reporting, news cycles. Human recovery doesn't operate on that kind of timeline. And when the 24-hour coverage ends after a crisis, people often assume that the worst has passed, that the visible emergency has passed, but that doesn't mean the impact of what happened is gone. So, communities and institutions define recovery by stabilization, getting services back, rebalancing the budget, people coming back to school or work, production restarting, that visible infrastructure and machinery functioning again. Human recovery hinges on something less concrete, things like the feeling of safety coming back, or rebuilding trust, or feeling comfortable in predictability. And that can take so much longer for some people. And there's a scale problem. Communities, institutions, organizations often operate at a population level, right? The policies are broadly applied, and the announcement needs to address everybody at once. It needs to somehow tell everybody's story in one or two sentences. Trauma operates at an individual scale. Even within the same event, people experience it differently, different levels of exposure, and different sense of the trauma and the loss, different pre-existing conditions. Two people standing on the same street can leave with very different internal experiences. And of course, leaders have to say the overarching umbrella message and speak to the collective, but they risk flattening what's actually happening to people. And that can create blind spots. It does create blind spots. So here's the situation. The crisis is over. The immediate crisis is over. Infrastructure is now stabilized. It's working properly. Leaders talk about progress. And now the narrative becomes resilience and rebuilding and renewal. But at the same time, some people might begin to struggle more. So after Hurricane Katrina, research documented that long-term mental health impacts lasted years beyond the storm itself. In fact, post-traumatic stress symptoms declined as the years went on. But 12 years after the hurricane, 1 in 6 people still had symptoms that showed they probably had post-traumatic stress disorder. Same thing after 9/11. The rates of post-traumatic stress symptoms lasted well beyond the first year, especially among people who were directly affected and had the highest trauma exposure. People who also had secondary stressors, or people who worked in or near the World Trade Center but had low disaster preparedness. And in California, they've had a lot of large scale wildfires recently, and communities reported mental health impacts that extend long after they started rebuilding physically. Increase in PTSD, depression, substance use, and suicidality, especially for young adults and low income survivors. It's been a little over a year since the LA fires, and the reminders are ever present. People still face housing instability. School was disrupted for many children. People are dealing with recovery issues like insurance claims and should they rebuild or should they move. And there's a physical reminder, the damaged homes, the empty lots, the charred trees. All of these things can slow recovery. So time has passed, but for some people, the distress is still there. And that pattern repeats after so many disasters. Leaders often want to think that time equals healing, which it absolutely does, just not at the same pace for everyone. Leaders want to think that acknowledging this thing publicly equates to closure. That's also not true. Visible functioning equals recovery. That's something we all want to believe. And that anniversaries mean progress for everyone. Now, they do. Anniversaries do mean progress, but not at the same rate for everyone. And these kind of assumptions make sense when you're thinking of an organizational logic, community leadership logic. The goal is to stabilize the system, restore services, and project steadiness. That is critical for everyone's recovery. There also is the belief that if you're not hearing from people, that means things are stable. If complaints decline, if people no longer are requesting assistance, if attendance at work or school improves, that feels reassuring. That means things are getting back to normal. And leaders often, after a certain time, decide that people will tell them if something is wrong. So if they don't hear anything, that means things are okay. But in reality, and so many of us know this from our own personal experience, most people don't volunteer psychological distress in formal settings like school or work. We downplay it, we normalize it. We compare ourselves to people who had it worse. Yeah, it happened to me, but this person had it worse. And we decide that what we went through doesn't warrant any kind of attention. And we also tend to have this belief that emotional impact belongs in private spaces, sharing with our family, our close friends, in our living room, coping personally. And then that's a boundary. And we then narrow the definition of what it looks like to lead after a recovery. We think the infrastructure rebuilding, that's a shared responsibility. But recalibrating emotionally, that is individual responsibility. Now, that division feels practical, and it is practical, and my emotional recalibration is my responsibility, but I interact with the infrastructure and the community and the organization. So that division can leave a gap. And there's also a very human reason we assume people are okay. We look for cues from each other. And when people show up and return to routines and don't raise any kind of alarms, we want that to be evidence of stability. So we want to calibrate to that visible stableness that we're seeing in most people. So if no one is openly struggling, we want that to mean that the crisis phase has passed. And there's a protective instinct at work too. After a crisis, especially a prolonged crisis, everyone wants some sort of relief. We want to get back to normal. And leaders have that responsibility. We look to them for direction and morale. So interpreting outward functioning as recovery is also a mechanism to reduce the collective anxiety and allow forward planning and restore that sense of control. Because one of the things that a trauma can do is take away our sense of control. And that's what people are desperately looking for. There's also an instinct to be fair. When we see people rebuilding quickly, we kind of want to assume that those conditions apply to everyone. We want to say that there are equal timelines and equal outcomes because that makes things simpler. And we also tend to equate productivity and showing up as wellness. So if someone shows up at work, they attend class, they're productive, they participate, we take that to mean they're steady internally. And none of these beliefs or assumptions come from neglect or not caring about our fellow humans. They come from normal cognitive shortcuts. The problem isn't the instinct. The problem is mistaking that outward function and normal appearance as proof that someone has recovered internally. Because what actually happens inside people is so different and it's individual to each of us. In the immediate aftermath of disruption, our adrenaline surges. We're in fight, flight, or freeze mode. We're protecting ourselves. And then other people mobilize. We help our neighbors. We complete the paperwork. We attend the meetings and the briefings. We start the rebuilding. We default to action. And that's good. And that action dominates. When the urgency fades and there's less of that action needed, for some people, that's when the nervous system begins to process what happens. And we know that anniversaries can reactivate symptoms, right? The smells, the sounds, the date, the sunlight, the headlines, those can all trigger responses. Researchers who study long-term trauma talk about multiple pathways to recovery. Some people, they're okay right away, stable resilience pretty early on. Some people have significant distress early and gradually recover over weeks or months or years. Some people seem stable right away, then they develop symptoms later. Other people, it changes over time. Sometimes they're stressed, sometimes they feel stable, and it depends on their life, other stressors, things that remind them of the event. And these trajectories are not visible in the first hours or days or weeks. So it seems counterintuitive, but someone who's functioning well early on doesn't guarantee long-term stability. And that recovery for each of us doesn't happen in isolation. We're still living in the world. There might be new stressors, job loss, financial strain, family conflict, and that can interact with the original event inside of us months later. So someone who was steady at 6 months may struggle at 18 months. When we measure recovery at a single checkpoint, we miss that moving nature of our adaptation, of the way we live as humans. As someone who lived through a public tragedy, I can tell you this. The world moves on faster than the body, at least for some of us. The first year after the Boston Marathon bombing brought enormous public attention. By year 2, there was still a lot of coverage, but not as much. And by year 5, maybe it was just the major anniversaries that drew notice. And that's okay. That's how it's supposed to be. We shouldn't stay stuck in the intensity and the depth of that coverage from the beginning. It's just that personal recovery doesn't necessarily follow that curve. As we said, some people regained their footing quickly, immediately. They kind of stood up, brushed themselves off, and they were fine. Others, like me, struggled for longer. Some people didn't discover symptoms until months later. The thing is, we can't predict that when the thing happens. Because it's not visible, because it's so individual, we can't see people with the mental health wounds right away. And that unpredictability is an important part of this story. Community leaders, organizational leaders, workplace leaders, we miss this gap for structural reasons because the system is designed to move on. There's funding immediately after the emergency, but then it drops off. The crisis team gets together, deals with the crisis, and then they demobilize and move on. The community builds family assistance centers and resiliency centers, but those are temporary and they close. The media moves on. They have to move on. New things are happening elsewhere. reporters get reassigned. And that's what's supposed to happen. And that's visible resolution, and the system rewards that. The quiet impact on survivors is less urgent for the system. And there's also a comfort in declaring a recovery. We all need hope. We need forward direction. We need that. And again, that's not wrong. It's just that that hope and that forward direction doesn't erase the fact that people are healing unevenly. And there's another thing that we often don't talk about because psychological distress is still something we don't like talking about, right? We can talk about physically rebuilding, talk about jobs, talk about housing, talk about infrastructure. Those are things that feel solid. Those feel like action. We can see the changes. Talking about sleep disruption, intrusive memories, irritability, or fear that people are feeling, that often just remains private. We don't like talking about that kind of stuff. And then that means people don't have feedback that it's actually still there. And leaders in our community and our workplaces may really hesitate to talk about that stuff and open that door because it can feel destabilizing to talk about the fact that people are having mental strain or like you're reopening a wound. And in some cases, it can feel politically risky. Like ignoring that long-term impact means that the recovery effort wasn't effective or that it was weak. And then there's a whole layer of resources. They are finite. Leaders have to deal with funding. It's going to end. What are you going to do with it? Visible rebuilding shows that tangible progress. It's measurable. Emotional recovery is not easy to measure. And when you don't have very many choices, we lean toward what can we photograph? What can we count? That's what we should be focusing on. And none of this is indifference to people suffering. It's structural incentives, it's our cultural habits. Without a deliberate effort to talk about these kind of things, the incentives direct attention towards what is visible and away from what individuals are feeling internally. So, of course, we can't freeze in the moment. We can't freeze things indefinitely, and we shouldn't. What we can do is plan for the long arc of recovery, that for some people, there are going to be long-term issues, not just the short bursts of motion. Build in some follow-up checkpoints. 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, whatever timeline makes sense for your group or organization. Continue to communicate. Keep those channels open. Even after the story's no longer in the news, it's still inside of people. Publicly talk about and normalize that nonlinear recovery progression. Talk about the facts that some people feel better right away and some don't even notice symptoms until later, that some have up and down like a roller coaster. Talk about it and avoid using that language of resilience as a signal that we're done with this and struggling should end. Like our people are resilient, and that means we're not going to do anything else to help them. Anniversaries should celebrate strength and forward motion and acknowledge that there still is an ongoing impact for people. The public story, we need to find a way for it to leave room for private timelines. The story is always going to move on. Life demands it. Media cycles demand it. Budgets demand it. But human recovery moves at its own pace. And leadership after crisis and disruption means being able to hold both realities at the same time. Forward motion and action with ongoing care and support. That means recognizing multiple recovery trajectories, understanding that some narratives can pressure people into silence, acknowledging that there are secondary stressors that can reignite the distress even after the initial event has faded. It means creating space for conversations that we often want to avoid. Progress doesn't mean pretending everyone feels better. Real progress and real resilience allows for uneven timelines. So when you think beyond what can be explicitly measured and celebrated, that reduces the distance between the public story and the private experience. And that distance, sometimes more than the disaster itself, is what determines who feels seen and who feels left behind. Whose recovery timeline are you using? Your systems or your people's? Thank you for listening to Notes on Resilience. I'm Manya Chilinsky, a speaker and advisor. My work focuses on how leaders support people through pressure and disruption. The show is edited by Neil Panji, and it's hosted on Buzzsprout. Subscribe to the podcast to stay connected and sign up for the newsletter at manyachilinsky.com/notes for monthly insights and updates.